My classmates called me a nobody at our 40-year high school reunion, and for a moment the room sounded exactly the same as it had in 1979, full of laughter that wasn't meant to include me. I stood just inside the ballroom doors of the Lakeshore Hotel in Chicago, holding the small plastic name tag the volunteer had handed me at the check-in table. The music was soft, something nostalgic from the late 70s, and clusters of gray-haired men and women were already gathered around tall cocktail tables, talking loudly about careers, grandchildren, and retirement homes in Florida. I had almost turned around and left before anyone noticed me. But then Brenda Collins looked up from across the room and said my name out loud, the way someone might point out an old yearbook photo that made them laugh. "Well, look who it is," she said, loud enough that the people around her turned. "Margaret Whitmore. I thought you vanished after graduation." A few people smiled politely. A few others leaned closer, trying to place the quiet girl they barely remembered. Brenda tilted her head and gave a little laugh that felt strangely familiar, the same one she used in the hallway outside algebra class 40 years ago. "You were always the quiet nobody in our class," she added, almost casually, like it was harmless nostalgia. Someone chuckled. Someone else shrugged and looked away. I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because smiling is sometimes the easiest way to keep a room from watching too closely. The ballroom lights reflected off polished wood floors and white tablecloths. The place smelled faintly of coffee and expensive candles. People were older now, heavier, softer around the eyes, but the rhythm of the room felt exactly the same as it had when we were 17. The confident voices. The inside jokes. The invisible lines that determined who belonged and who didn't. I walked slowly toward an empty chair near the wall and set my purse down. No one stopped me. No one asked where I had been for the last 40 years. A man I vaguely remembered from the football team was describing his real estate business in Phoenix to anyone within earshot. Two women near the bar were comparing pictures of their grandchildren on their phones. Brenda was still watching me from across the room with a curious little smile, like she was waiting to see if I would try to prove something. I lifted the plastic cup of water from the table and took a sip. Cold, clean, ordinary. In high school, I had learned something important about rooms like this. The loudest people were usually the ones who believed they understood everyone else. They thought they knew exactly how the story ended. They believed the quiet girl in the back row would always stay the quiet girl in the back row. Brenda eventually walked closer, heels clicking softly against the floor. "So, Margaret," she said, folding her arms in a way that suggested friendly curiosity, but felt more like inspection. "What did you end up doing with your life?" The question floated in the air for a moment, and a few nearby classmates leaned closer, the way people do when they sense the possibility of an awkward answer. I looked around the room again. The decorations. The banner that read "Welcome Class of '79. The laughter. The same old expectations hanging quietly over everything. I smiled again, calm and patient, the way someone smiles when they already know something the rest of the room hasn't discovered yet. I held the plastic cup of water between my hands and watched the room move the way it always had around Brenda Collins. She had the kind of presence that pulled attention toward her without effort, the same way it had when we were teenagers walking the halls of Lincoln Ridge High School. Some people never lose that role. Even after 4 decades, they still carry the same invisible crown they wore at 17. Brenda leaned against the edge of the table beside me and waited for my answer, her smile patient but sharp around the edges. The small group of classmates nearby had gone quiet, pretending to study their drinks while they listened. Someone adjusted the banner on the far wall that read "Welcome Class of '79. Someone else laughed too loudly at a joke from the bar area. The music changed to a softer song from the early 80s, and the sound drifted through the room like a memory everyone shared except me. I looked down at the name tag on my jacket, Margaret Whitmore. The ink had smudged slightly where the volunteer had written it with a marker. It looked simple, ordinary. Brenda followed my gaze and chuckled, lightly. "You were always quiet," she said. "I remember teachers barely noticing you were in the room." A few people smiled awkwardly. One man nodded as if that detail confirmed a story he had already decided was true. I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life. Quiet. Invisible. Easy to overlook. It was strange how people could believe they understood someone simply because they had seen one small version of them a long time ago. Brenda lifted her glass and took a slow sip before speaking again. "So, what happened after graduation?" she asked. "Did you stay in Illinois?" I shook my head gently. "No," I said. My voice sounded calm, almost distant, even to me. I remember the summer after graduation as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. A small apartment above a hardware store. A borrowed car with a cracked windshield. My father standing in the driveway the morning I left town with a toolbox in one hand and a paper bag of sandwiches in the other. He had not said much. He had simply nodded and told me that the world was bigger than the streets we grew up on. I took another sip of water and looked across the ballroom again. Some of the classmates were beginning to glance at their phones. Others had drifted into conversations about retirement plans and travel. Brenda was still waiting. The same curious smile remained on her face, but now there was something else in her expression, something like expectation. She believed she already knew the answer. She believed the quiet girl from the back row would tell a quiet story. Maybe a small job. Maybe a simple life somewhere no one would notice. I set the cup down on the table slowly and folded my hands together. The room continued moving around us, unaware that the story everyone thought they knew had only just begun. I watched Brenda Collins closely as she waited for the small, ordinary story she expected to hear, the kind of answer that would confirm everything she believed about me when we were 17 years old. The room around us continued its slow rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and polite conversations that drifted from table to table like background music. Someone near the bar was talking about his second home in Arizona. A woman beside him was describing a cruise she had taken through the Caribbean. The words floated through the air with an easy confidence that came from people who believed their lives had followed the correct path. Brenda tapped her fingers lightly against the edge of the table and tilted her head again, waiting. I could see the same familiar curiosity in her eyes, the same quiet certainty that the quiet girl from the back row had probably remained quiet forever. I thought about the first winter after I left Illinois, the cold mornings when I worked inside a warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio. The building was enormous, nearly 3 football fields long, with steel shelves stacked almost 30 feet high and forklifts moving through narrow lanes like careful machines. I remember wearing a heavy coat inside because the loading doors stayed open most of the day, letting the wind roll across the concrete floors. My job was simple at the beginning. I checked shipments. I counted boxes. I stayed late after everyone else left because the supervisor trusted me to finish the inventory reports. It was not glamorous work. It was quiet work. But quiet work gives a person time to observe things other people ignore. I noticed how trucks arrived late because the routes were poorly planned. I noticed how deliveries crossed 3 states when they could have crossed 1. I noticed how small inefficiencies quietly cost companies thousands of dollars every week. Over time, I began writing down ideas in a small notebook I carried in my coat pocket. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. Just solutions no one else had bothered to consider. Brenda was still watching me now, waiting for a story that would confirm her memory of the girl who rarely spoke in class. The same small group of classmates lingered nearby, pretending not to listen but clearly curious. One of them leaned closer to the table, resting his elbow beside the empty name tags stacked in a plastic tray. I lifted my eyes and met Brenda's gaze again. Her expression had softened slightly, almost like she was beginning to feel a small amount of sympathy. It was the kind of sympathy people offer when they assume someone else has lived a smaller life. I folded my hands calmly on the table and remembered the day I finally left that warehouse 10 years later, not because the work was difficult, but because I had spent an entire decade learning how the system really worked. Some people spend years trying to prove themselves. I spent years simply understanding how everything moved. And once you understand how something moves, you can change where it goes. I could see Brenda Collins still studying my face, as if she was trying to place something that did not quite fit the picture she remembered from high school. The music in the ballroom shifted again, and someone near the stage tested the microphone for the upcoming announcements. The sound echoed briefly through the room before fading back into the steady hum of conversations. I rested my hands on the edge of the table and watched a group of classmates laugh near the bar. Their laughter sounded comfortable, practiced, the kind that comes from people who believe their lives have followed a familiar script. Brenda leaned slightly closer. "So you worked in a warehouse," she said slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. Her tone was polite, but there was still that faint trace of amusement behind it, the same quiet assumption that the quiet girl from Lincoln Ridge High School must have stayed in small places doing small things. I nodded once. "Yes," I said calmly. "For a long time." The answer seemed to satisfy her for a moment. She lifted her drink and glanced toward the others nearby, almost like she expected them to smile along with her. But I remained still, remembering something else from those long years inside that enormous building in Ohio. I remembered the late nights after the trucks stopped arriving, when the warehouse grew quiet enough that you could hear the heating system humming through the metal ceiling. I would sit at a narrow desk under a fluorescent light and study the shipping routes on a map spread across the table. Lines drawn between cities. Small numbers written beside them. Distances measured in miles that most people never noticed because they were hidden behind computer systems and routine schedules. But the longer I studied those maps, the more I realized something simple. Most companies moved their goods the same way people followed habits. They repeated the same routes because they had always repeated them. They trusted the system because no one had ever questioned it. And sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest question. What if the route could be shorter? What if the trucks did not need to cross 3 states to reach a destination 200 miles away? What if the warehouse itself was in the wrong place? I began sketching new plans in that little notebook I carried every day. Not because anyone had asked me to. Not because I expected anyone to notice. I did it because quiet work gives a person something rare. Time to see patterns other people miss. Brenda set her glass down again and folded her arms. "That must have been a simple life," she said lightly. "Very steady." Her words floated across the table like a compliment, but the meaning underneath them was clear. Simple. Predictable. Small. I looked around the ballroom again at the bright lights and the familiar faces that had once shared classrooms with me decades ago. Then I looked back at Brenda and allowed a small calm smile to return to my face. Because what she did not know was that those quiet years inside that warehouse had not been the end of my story. They had been the beginning of everything that came next. I noticed the way Brenda Collins lifted her eyebrows slightly when I said nothing more. She was waiting for the rest of the story. The part where a quiet warehouse job turned into an ordinary retirement, and a small house somewhere outside town. That was the ending she expected. Around us the ballroom had grown louder. Someone had turned the music up a little, and the bass of the speakers hummed through the floor. A tall man from our old baseball team had started telling a long story about a business deal in Texas, and several people gathered around him, nodding with polite admiration. The smell of coffee drifted from a refreshment table near the stage. Everything about the room felt predictable, like a reunion designed to confirm that life had unfolded exactly the way everyone imagined it would. Brenda rested one hand on the back of the chair beside me and glanced toward the others. "So you stayed in logistics all those years," she said, almost thoughtfully. "That must have been comfortable. Reliable work." The word comfortable hung in the air for a moment. I knew what she meant. Comfortable usually means safe, small, unremarkable. I picked up the plastic cup again and turned it slowly between my fingers. "It taught me a lot," I said. Brenda gave a soft laugh. "I suppose it did." But the truth was something very different from the picture she had in her mind. During those quiet nights in the warehouse, I had not only studied the shipping routes. I had started talking to drivers. I listened to their stories about long hauls across Indiana and Pennsylvania. I asked questions about how deliveries were scheduled and why trucks sometimes returned half empty. Most people never ask those questions because they assume the system already worked. But systems built from habit often hide enormous opportunities. After nearly 10 years, I had filled several notebooks with route maps, cost estimates, and ideas for new distribution centers placed exactly where they would save companies thousands of miles every week. The first time I presented those ideas was in a small office above the loading docks. The company manager had stared at the pages in silence for nearly 5 minutes. Then, he asked me a question I will never forget. He said, "Margaret, if these numbers are correct, why has no one else suggested this before?" I told him something simple. I said most people are too busy talking to notice the patterns quietly moving around them. Brenda cleared her throat softly, pulling my attention back to the present moment in the ballroom. She seemed slightly impatient now, as if she expected me to reach the point of the story. A few more classmates had drifted closer, pretending to refill their drinks while they listened. One woman whispered something to the man beside her, and both of them glanced toward me with curious expressions. Brenda folded her arms again. "Well," she said with a polite smile, "it sounds like you found a steady career after all." I nodded slowly, because what she still did not realize was that those maps, those conversations with truck drivers, and those quiet notebooks had not simply given me a steady career. They had given me the blueprint for building something far larger than anyone in this room could imagine. I could see the moment Brenda Collins decided she had heard enough of my story. Her polite smile returned, the same expression people use when they believe a conversation has reached its predictable ending. Around us, the ballroom had grown even louder as more classmates arrived. The microphone near the stage crackled briefly as someone tested it again, and a voice announced that the reunion program would begin shortly. People slowly drifted toward their seats, carrying drinks and laughing about memories from a school that had not changed much in their minds even after 40 years. Brenda glanced toward the stage, and then back at me. "Well, Margaret," she said lightly, "it sounds like you kept yourself busy." The sentence sounded friendly, but it carried the quiet finality of someone closing a book they believed they had already read. A few classmates nearby nodded politely before turning back to their conversations. I did not interrupt them. I simply watched the room for a moment. The large windows along the far wall reflected the golden lights hanging from the ceiling. Outside, the evening streets of Chicago were beginning to glow with traffic moving steadily through the city. Inside the ballroom, everything felt comfortable, almost routine. The class of 1979 had gathered to celebrate the past, not to question it. I lifted my eyes toward the entrance doors at the far end of the room. For a moment they remained closed, framed by tall indoor plants and a small registration table where the volunteers had been greeting guests earlier in the evening. Then the doors opened quietly. 3 men stepped inside, dressed in dark suits that looked noticeably more formal than the relaxed jackets most people were wearing at the reunion. Their movements were calm and professional, the kind that draws attention not because it is loud but because it is precise. At first only a few people near the back noticed them. A woman paused in the middle of a sentence. Someone else turned slightly in their chair. The 3 men walked across the edge of the room, scanning the tables with quiet focus. Brenda noticed the shift in attention and followed several glances toward the entrance. Her expression changed slightly, confusion replacing the easy confidence she had worn all evening. One of the men spoke briefly to a staff member near the registration table and then continued walking across the ballroom floor. His gaze moved from table to table until it settled directly on me. He approached with the same calm professionalism, stopping a few feet from where I sat. The nearby conversations grew quieter as people began to notice the unexpected visitors. The man gave a respectful nod. "Ms. Whitmore," he said clearly, his voice carrying just enough for several surrounding tables to hear. "Your security team has arrived. The car will be ready whenever you are prepared to leave." For a moment, the entire section of the ballroom fell silent. I could feel dozens of eyes shift toward me all at once. Brenda Collins stared at the man and then slowly turned back toward my face, the confident smile she had worn earlier now completely gone. I did not stand up immediately. The man in the dark suit remained calm and professional, waiting patiently beside the table as if this moment was perfectly ordinary. Around us, the room had gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that appears when a conversation suddenly changes direction and everyone realizes they may have misunderstood something important. Brenda Collins stared at the man for a few seconds, then slowly looked back at me again. The expression on her face had shifted from confidence to uncertainty, like someone trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. "Security team?" she repeated softly, almost to herself. A few people at the nearby tables exchanged glances. Someone whispered a question. Someone else pulled out a phone, as if trying to check something quickly. I could feel the attention spreading across the room the same way a ripple moves across still water. The man beside me spoke again, his voice calm and respectful. "There is no rush, Ms. Whitmore. We are ready whenever you are." I nodded slightly, acknowledging him, but I did not rise yet. Instead, I turned back toward Brenda and the small group of classmates standing nearby. The earlier laughter had completely disappeared. Now there was only curiosity and something else beneath it. The kind of cautious curiosity people feel when they realize the story they believed might not be correct after all. Brenda cleared her throat and forced a small smile that looked much less certain than before. "Margaret," she said slowly, "what exactly do you do these days?" The question sounded very different now. It was no longer casual. It was careful. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table and looked around the ballroom once more. Some of the conversations had stopped completely. A few people were openly watching us now. Others pretended to continue talking but kept glancing in my direction every few seconds. I could even hear someone quietly asking the volunteer at the registration table if they had a program listing the attendees. Brenda followed my gaze, noticing the attention building around us, and her voice softened slightly. "You mentioned logistics earlier," she added. "Is that still what you do?" I allowed myself a small, calm smile. "Yes," I said. "Logistics." The words sounded simple, almost ordinary. But a few seconds later the man standing beside me shifted slightly, and another voice spoke from across the room. It came from the tall man near the bar who had been talking earlier about his real estate business in Texas. He was staring at his phone now, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Wait a minute," he said loudly enough that several tables turned toward him. He looked up at me again, and then back down at the screen. "Whitmore Logistics," he read slowly. "The National Distribution Company." A murmur spread through the room. The man took another step forward, still looking at his phone. "It says the founder and chief executive officer is Margaret Whitmore." He lifted his head and looked directly at me, the surprise still clear in his voice. "Is that you?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds after the man near the bar asked it, and the silence that followed felt very different from the earlier laughter that had filled the room. Dozens of eyes turned toward me now. Some curious, some surprised, some quietly trying to remember whether they had heard that company name before. Brenda Collins stood completely still beside the table, her expression slowly changing as the meaning of the moment began to settle in. I looked toward the man holding his phone and gave a small nod. "Yes," I said calmly. The word was simple, but the effect it had on the room was immediate. Several people began whispering at once. Someone else lifted their own phone and started typing quickly. The tall man stepped closer, still staring at the screen as if he wanted to confirm what he had just read. "Whitmore Logistics," he repeated again. "You built that company?" I folded my hands lightly in front of me and answered with the same steady voice I had used all evening. "Yes. I started it about 25 years ago." Another quiet wave of murmurs spread across the ballroom. One woman near the stage said something under her breath, and the man beside her leaned over to look at her phone. The name of the company was moving through the room now, table by table, the way news always spreads when people suddenly realize they are standing close to something unexpected. Brenda's eyes moved from the man with the phone back to me again. The confident smile she had worn earlier had completely disappeared. In its place was a careful expression, almost thoughtful now, like someone reviewing a memory from long ago and realizing it may have been incomplete. "Margaret," she said slowly, "that company is huge." I shrugged gently. "It has grown over the years." The man with the phone looked up again. "It says here the company manages distribution centers across 16 states, he said. "And the revenue numbers are..." He stopped mid-sentence and looked back at the screen again before finishing quietly. "That is impressive." I did not respond to the numbers. I simply glanced around the ballroom again. The earlier noise had softened. Conversations had turned into quieter discussions, and several classmates were now openly watching the small circle that had formed around our table. The man in the dark suit beside me remained perfectly still, waiting respectfully. Brenda exhaled slowly and shook her head once, almost in disbelief. "All these years," she said quietly, And no one here knew. I looked at her and allowed the same calm smile to return. Most people did not ask. I replied gently. The statement was not meant as criticism. It was simply the truth. For a moment Brenda said nothing more. The room waited. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom another person whispered the company name again, this time with a tone that sounded very different from the laughter that had filled the room earlier. I could feel the atmosphere in the ballroom change in a quiet but unmistakable way. A few minutes earlier the room had been filled with easy laughter and comfortable assumptions, the kind that grow from memories that are never questioned. Now the same people were watching me with a very different kind of attention. Some looked curious. Some looked impressed. A few simply looked surprised that the quiet girl from Lincoln Ridge High School had built something none of them had expected. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the table and slowly stood up from the chair. The man from my security team stepped slightly to the side, giving me space while still remaining nearby. Across the room, I could see several classmates whispering to each other while glancing down at their phones. The name Whitmore Logistics was traveling through the ballroom now like a new story, replacing an old one. Brenda Collins watched me carefully as I stood. Her expression was no longer confident or dismissive. Instead, it looked thoughtful, almost uncertain. For the first time that evening, she seemed to be studying me the way people study someone they realize they never truly understood. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I had no idea." I gave a small nod. "That is understandable," I replied gently. My voice remained calm, the same way it had been since the beginning of the evening. I looked around the room once more, taking in the banners, the tables, and the familiar faces that had once filled classrooms and hallways decades earlier. So many of them had built good lives in their own ways. Careers, families, stories worth celebrating. But the difference between then and now was something simple. Back then, many of them believed they already knew who everyone would become. I stepped away from the chair and picked up my purse from the table. The security officer waited quietly beside me, professional and patient. Brenda took a small step forward as if she wanted to say something else, but the words seemed to hesitate before leaving her mouth. Finally, she spoke again. "You must have worked very hard," she said. I smiled slightly. "Yes," I answered. But the work itself was not the most important part. She looked puzzled. What was? I paused for a moment, considering the question. Then I spoke in the same steady tone I had used all evening. Learning not to let other people decide how big your life can become. The sentence hung gently in the air between us.
No anger, no accusation.
Just a simple truth. Around us the ballroom remained quiet as people continued to watch. I gave Brenda one last polite nod and turned toward the entrance doors. The security team walked beside me as we crossed the polished floor and moved through the open doorway into the cool Chicago evening. Outside, the city lights stretched down the street and traffic moved steadily through the night. Behind me, the doors of the ballroom closed softly, leaving the reunion and its old assumptions inside while I stepped forward into the life I had built far beyond them.